For 7 months, a dog slept outside a baby's room every single night without being asked. And when the night finally came that he didn't, the reason he wasn't, there was the reason the baby was still alive by morning. Nobody told Boone to do it. Nobody trained him. Nobody even noticed, at first, that he was doing it at all. That is where this story begins. Petra Calloway was not the kind of woman who believed in signs. She was the kind of woman who worked 12-hour shifts, came home to a child who still didn't sleep through the night, warmed up whatever she'd managed to cook on Sunday, and told herself she was doing fine. She was the kind of woman who said she was fine so often that she'd almost stopped hearing herself say it. She had a house that smelled like baby laundry and dog fur, and the particular cold of a New England winter seeping in under the front door. She had a job that demanded everything from her, and a life that demanded the rest. She had Wren, 8 months old, the best and most exhausting thing that had ever happened to her. And she had Boone. Boone was a large, somewhat ungainly dog, part Labrador, part Border Collie, all intensity, with a dark brindle coat that never quite dried fully in winter, and ears that couldn't decide whether to stand up or fold over. In photographs, he looked like 2 different dogs, depending on the light. In person, there was nothing uncertain about him. He moved through the house with the focused, purposeful quality of an animal who had assigned himself responsibilities that no one had explained to him, and no one needed to. Petra had adopted him 3 years before Wren was born, in the early months of a marriage that was already quietly failing, in the way that some marriages do, not with arguments or crisis, but with a slow withdrawal, the gradual putting away of shared things, the careful avoidance of conversations that would cost too much. Her ex-husband, Rowan, had been a decent man who wanted a different life. Not a worse life, not a better one. Different in ways he couldn't articulate and she couldn't fill, and they had both understood this a year before either of them said it, and in that year she had adopted a dog. She had not done it deliberately, as a substitute or a consolation. She had done it because one afternoon, in the animal shelter 2 towns over, a large brindle dog had been sitting very quietly in the middle of his kennel, watching her with the specific attention of an animal who had already decided something. She had asked the volunteer about him. The volunteer had said he was 2 years old, a surrender from a family that had relocated, good with children, good with other animals, not particularly good with being left alone for long stretches, because he had what the volunteer called a very active sense of responsibility. Petra had laughed at that. She had also signed the adoption papers. The marriage ended 6 months later. Boone stayed. She had sometimes thought, on the worst nights of that first year alone, the nights when the house felt too large and too quiet, and the decision to keep it had seemed more principled than practical, that the order of those 2 events was not a coincidence. Boone had arrived before the unraveling finished, which meant he had been there for all of it, the quiet dinners and the quieter weeks, and the conversation that finally said out loud what both of them already knew. He had been there through the packing and the paperwork, and the first night in a house that was suddenly fully hers. He had slept at the foot of the bed that night, and he had not moved until morning, and she had understood, in the wordless way that you understand things that don't translate into language, that he had chosen his place. She had not expected to be pregnant a year later. She had not expected, frankly, a great many things about the 18 months that followed. The relationship with a man named Callum, brief and significant, and then suddenly, bewilderingly over in the way of things that happened too fast to properly see, had produced Wren, and Wren had produced a reorganization of Petra's understanding of what she was capable of. She was a nurse. She understood the body. She had thought she was prepared for the physical reality of having a child. She had been spectacularly wrong about this, and wrong in ways that surprised her, not the obvious difficulties, but the ones nobody mentioned. The disorientation of loving something so completely and so immediately that your own edges blurred, the sensation of being simultaneously the most and least capable you had ever been. The weight of being the only person in a particular building who was responsible for keeping another human being alive. She was 31 years old. She owned a house in a small city in western Massachusetts. She had a job she was good at, a mother who was helpful but lived 2 hours away, a handful of friends who had their own children and their own exhaustions, and who she saw less often than she meant to. She had Wren, and she had Boone, and some mornings, standing in her kitchen in the winter dark, while the baby monitor glowed and the coffee made its sound that felt like enough. Most mornings, actually. She would remember, later, how much she had been fine, how ordinary those months had seemed from the inside. She would remember the feeding schedules and the pediatric appointments and the question of sleep training that she'd researched extensively and then mostly abandoned, and she would try to locate, in all of it, the moment she should have known. There was no such moment. The whole point was that there was no such moment. The whole point was that it was invisible. That was the part she could not stop thinking about. The first night, Petra noticed the behavior. Wren was 11 weeks old, and she herself was running on approximately 4 hours of sleep stretched across 3 different fragments of the night. She had gotten up at 2 in the morning to check the monitor, not because it had alarmed, but because of a silence she didn't trust. New mothers develop this, a particular sensitivity to the quality of quiet, the ability to distinguish between the silence of a child sleeping and the silence of something else. It is not rational. It is older than rational. Petra, who spent her working hours in the rational reading data, following protocols, making assessments based on evidence, had found this instinct strange and inconvenient at first, and then had stopped questioning it. She stepped into the hallway and nearly tripped over Boone. He was lying directly in front of Wren's door, not beside it, not near it. In front of it, pressed against the base of the door, his large body oriented so that his face was toward the hallway and his back was against the wood. Like something between a draft stopper and a guard, he was awake. His head was raised and his eyes were on her, steady and calm, neither guilty about being somewhere unusual nor asking for anything. She said his name. He wagged once, a single measured sweep of the tail, and put his head back down. She stepped over him. She went into Wren's room and checked. The monitor had been accurate. Wren was sleeping, the miniature chest rising and falling in the slow rhythm that still seemed, every time, like a kind of miracle, and she went back to bed. She assumed Boone would move by morning. He was a dog. Dogs did things for their own reasons. She had more pressing things to think about. He wasn't in the hallway when her alarm went off at 6:15. He was in front of the door. Same position. Different morning. He raised his head when she came out, wagged twice, and watched her walk to Wren's room. He watched her come back out with the baby. He watched them go down the stairs. And then, when she came back up 20 minutes later to get the diaper bag she'd forgotten, he had moved. Not back to the living room, not to his bed. He was sitting at the top of the stairs, looking down, as if considering whether his presence at the bottom would be more useful. She thought, border collie. She thought, herding instinct, protectiveness. A dog who has been alone in a house for 2 years and suddenly has a small creature to organize his considerable attentiveness around. She gave him his breakfast. He ate half of it. She noticed this, but did not attach significance to it. Dogs sometimes ate less in the winter. The cold made the kitchen drafty, and he had always been particular about eating somewhere warm. She drove to work. She did not ask the question she was not yet equipped to ask. There are things that dogs perceive that human beings have documented carefully, and things they perceive that human beings are only beginning to understand. The architecture of canine scent detection is not merely more sophisticated than ours. it is structurally different in ways that make comparison nearly meaningless. A human being navigates the world primarily through vision, secondarily through sound. A dog navigates it primarily through smell, in a way that gives them access to information about their environment that is invisible to every other sense, and to every instrument that has not been specifically designed to detect what a dog detects. They smell time. They smell the residue of events that occurred hours or days earlier. They smell disease, some of them, not because they were trained to, but because the chemical changes that accompany certain physiological processes produce compounds that rise to the surface of skin and breath and exist in the air around a person's body, readable to an animal whose nose contains, in the right breed, 220 million olfactory receptors compared to the human's 5 million. They smell emotion. The adrenaline of fear and the cortisol of stress and the oxytocin of connection. They are not metaphors or interpretations to a dog. They are facts, molecular and specific, carried in the air of every room that a person has occupied. What Boone could smell, lying in the hallway outside Wren's room, with his face pressed toward the gap under the door, was something that has no name in any language Petra spoke. But it had a name in chemistry. Carbon monoxide is colorless. It is odorless to human beings, a fact that is the source of its particular danger. It does not irritate the airway. It does not produce immediate symptoms at low concentrations. It enters the bloodstream through the lungs, binds to hemoglobin more effectively than oxygen, and displaces the oxygen that cells need to function, quietly and incrementally, in a way that the body registers as fatigue, as headache, as a mild persistent wrongness that is easy to attribute to other things. A parent who is already exhausted. A baby who is already prone to illness. A winter that has gone on too long. Carbon monoxide detectors exist specifically because human beings cannot do what Boone was doing. They exist because the history of carbon monoxide is a history of people not knowing, not smelling, not detecting, waking up sick or not waking up at all in rooms that felt like every other room. What some dogs can detect, and the research here is newer and less complete than the popular understanding of it, is the MESA, trace chemical signature that accompanies incomplete combustion, compounds that exist alongside carbon monoxide in concentrations below what any standard detector is calibrated to alarm at. They are not detecting carbon monoxide itself, but the complex chemical family it belongs to, the molecular indicators of combustion that has not completed cleanly. A faulty furnace is not just a source of carbon monoxide. It is a source of dozens of related compounds, a fingerprint of mechanical failure that some animals can read the way a diagnostician reads a pattern of symptoms. Boone could not have named what he was smelling. He had no concept of chemistry, no framework for understanding the mechanism. What he had was a nose reading the air of that hallway and finding something that was not supposed to be there, something that did not belong in the air around a sleeping infant, something that told him, in whatever wordless register his brain processed such things, that this was a place where he was needed. He was 11 weeks into this when Petra stepped over him in the dark for the first time. He would be 11 weeks into it before she noticed, and 5 more months beyond that before she would understand. November became December with the speed that time has when you are not sleeping. Petra's life contracted into the tunnel that all new parents know. Not bad tunnel, not all of it. There are pockets of extraordinary light in that tunnel. The mornings when the baby does something new, the evenings when everything goes right, the moments of such complete presence that the exhaustion falls away briefly, and what's left is something close to grace. But it is a tunnel. The outside world retreats. The news stops meaning anything. Social plans become aspirational. The architecture of your days is built around a 6-hour cycle of feeding and sleeping, and the perpetual question of whether the baby is warm enough, sleeping safely, eating enough, developing correctly, loved sufficiently. She had Wren's 2-month appointment, his 4-month appointment. She talked to the pediatrician about the ear infections, 2 of them, back to back, a pattern the doctor said was not unusual for winter infants in older homes with lower air quality. Something about the relationship between environmental air and ear canal pressure in developing systems. Petra listened to this carefully, asked her follow-up questions, and drove home. She gave Wren his amoxicillin. She ordered an air purifier. She called her sister and said she was fine. She noticed Boone in the hallway on most nights when she was up with Wren, his shape visible in the thin light under the baby's door. She had stopped being surprised by this. She had started being grateful for it in a vague, unexamined way, the same way she was grateful for the good monitor and the white noise machine and the Always pediatric app on her phone that let you log feeds and track sleep windows. Boone in the hallway was a thing that was happening. It felt like safety. She didn't ask what kind. There were things she noticed during those months that she would reread later like sentences from a chapter she'd misunderstood the first time. Boone's appetite was not itself. Not dramatically. He was not the kind of dog who stopped eating entirely, who performed illness in ways that demanded attention. But he was eating less than his usual amount, leaving the last third of his bowl more mornings than not. And she had adjusted his portion slightly because she'd read that older dogs sometimes needed less. Even though Boone was 4 and not old, not really. She had attributed it to the cold, to the adjustment to the baby, to the border collie tendency toward selective eating. There were mornings when she found him at the back door before she was fully awake, waiting with a quality of urgency that wasn't his usual patient morning energy. He went out and stood in the cold for longer than he normally did, not sniffing around the yard in the distracted way of a dog on his morning walk, but standing still with his nose up and his chest moving in deep, deliberate pulls of winter air. She watched him from the kitchen window while the coffee brewed and thought that he was cold, that the house had gotten drafty again, that she needed to check the weather stripping on the back door. She did not think, he is treating the outside air like medicine. She did not think, he comes out here every morning to counteract something. On 2 occasions, she found him sitting at the top of the stairs, looking slightly dazed, a word she would not have used at the time, because she was not looking for it, in the flat, inward-facing way of an animal experiencing something internal that it cannot explain. Both times she called his name and he focused back on her immediately, tail up, the ears doing their thing. Both times she decided she had imagined it. She had not imagined it. What she had done was see it clearly and then look away, because she was a person under pressure with limited bandwidth, and because the human mind, given a choice between 2 interpretations of something unfamiliar, one benign and one alarming, will, under pressure, almost always choose the one it can live with. She chose to live with. He's fine. He's a dog. Dogs do things. In January, she had a conversation with her colleague Deja that she would return to many times afterward. Deja was the person at work whose judgment Petra trusted most, not because they were close friends. They were, but that wasn't the reason, but because Deja had a way of asking the right question without needing to know why it was the right question. She had 3 children. She had been a nurse for 15 years, and she had an instinct for the thing that was being said around rather than directly. The conversational gap where the real concern was living. They were in the break room between patients mid-morning, the particular tired-running quality of a busy Thursday. Petra had mentioned the ear infections, the low-grade fever that kept cycling back, the sense she had, difficult to articulate in clinical language, which was the only kind she trusted herself with, that she was missing something, that the picture had a detail she wasn't reading correctly. Deja had listened to this with her coffee cup held with both hands, looking at Petra in the quiet, diagnostic way she had. She asked, "What kind of heating system does your house have?" Petra said she had electric baseboards in the bedrooms and a central propane system for the main heat. Deja asked, When was the last time the furnace was serviced? Petra thought about it. She said she thought the previous owners had had it serviced, based on a sticker on the unit, but she hadn't had it done herself since buying the house 18 months ago. Deja nodded. She said, old propane systems sometimes have issues with the heat exchanger. She had a patient once, she said. A family. Actually, not a patient. A family she had known, who had a similar constellation of low-grade illness in a young child, recurring and non-specific, and it had turned out to be related to air quality from an aging furnace. She wasn't saying that was this. She was saying it might be worth having checked. Petra's pager went off. She said she'd think about it. What she actually did was go home that evening and look at the baseboard heater in Wren's room. Electric. Fine. She stood in the room and breathed the air and felt nothing wrong. She told herself that Deja had been talking about a gas system, which Wren's room didn't have. She told herself she was looking for a problem because she was tired, and tired people found patterns that weren't there. She told herself she was fine. She walked back out of the room. Boone was in the hallway. He looked at her. She stepped over him and went to bed. The winter deepened. Petra developed, across those months, the particular competence of a person who is operating at the edge of their capacity, not collapsing. Because collapsing was not something she had ever done easily, but running on a maintenance protocol, the minimum inputs for maximum function, an efficiency that looked from the outside like capability and felt from the inside like a form of controlled dissociation. She went to work. She came home. She fed Wren and bathed Wren and read to Wren from the soft books with the crinkly pages that he had developed an intense relationship with. She took Boone out in the mornings and evenings, the short circuits of the neighborhood that winter required, and she noticed that on these walks, Boone moved differently than he used to, not limping, not obviously slowing, but something in his gait that was slightly less than what it had been, a quality of effort where there used to be effortlessness. She attributed this, each time she noticed it, to something benign. The cold, the hardwood floors. Age, though he wasn't old. Winter weight gain, though he was lighter than he'd been. She was right that something had changed. She was wrong about the reason. What was happening to Boone, in the nights he spent lying on the cold hardwood outside Wren's door, was the same thing that was happening more slowly, at lower concentrations, to Wren. His smaller mass absorbed it differently. His respiratory rate was faster. He spent 8 hours a night lying in a corridor where the ductwork ran along the ceiling and the accumulated trace was highest near the floor, breathing in air that had a chemical imbalance his body was noting and compensating for, and as the months passed, no longer fully compensating for. He was sick, not dramatically, not in ways that would have triggered an emergency, but his red blood cells were carrying less oxygen than they should have been, and his body was working harder for the same results. And the tiredness and the reduced appetite and the occasional morning dazedness were not behavioral or psychological or a response to the cold. They were symptoms. They were his body saying, in the only language it had, that something in this house was costing him something. And every evening he went back. Every evening, when the house settled and the lights went off and Wren went down for the night, Boone went to the hallway and lay down in front of the door and stayed until morning. 7 months of this. What it cost him would only become visible later in a number on a veterinary scale, in a blood panel read by a soft-spoken man with 30 years of practice and a moment of careful silence before he spoke. But the cost was accumulating, night by night, in a house where nobody knew to look. February arrived with the particular relentlessness of a New England winter that has decided it has more to say. The cold was not the spectacular kind, not the single-digit temperatures that made the news. It was the grinding, sustained cold of a month that simply refused to warm. That kept the ground frozen, and the windows clouded, and the heating systems running longer and harder than they had in October or November or December. Furnaces across the region were working at their maximum sustained capacity. Components that had been marginal cycling on longer and hotter than they were designed to. The maintenance issues that had been adequate in moderate weather becoming inadequate in sustained cold. Petra had made small adjustments to the house over those months in the way that people do. Not systematically, not from any diagnosis of what was wrong, but in the instinctive incremental way of someone trying to make a place feel right. She had bought the air purifier after the second ear infection. She had re-caulked the windows in Wren's room herself on a Saturday afternoon. Wren on a blanket on the floor, watching her with the focused attention he brought to anything she did with her hands. She had moved the humidifier. She had read about the relationship between winter air quality and infant respiratory health and taken 3 or 4 of the suggested steps and then gotten busy and stopped. She had not thought about the heating system. She had not had a reason to think about the heating system in the way that you don't have a reason to think about the infrastructure of your life until it fails you. It is simply there, doing its job, the warmth arriving from vents in the walls the way warmth is supposed to arrive, not requiring her attention, not asking anything of her. On the mornings in February, when she woke with a headache, she attributed it to sleep deprivation. There were studies, she knew, about the long-term neurological effects of sustained sleep disruption in new mothers, and she filed her headaches under that category, which was plausible and available, and asked nothing of her beyond what she was already doing. She had mentioned it to her own doctor at her annual in January. The headaches, the persistent fatigue that seemed to exceed even the generous explanation of new parenthood, and her doctor had run a Cohn panel and found nothing significant and said what all doctors said in such situations. Try to rest when you can. Make sure you're eating enough. The first year is hard. Petra had nodded and agreed and gone home and continued. She was not wrong to file the headaches under sleep deprivation. She was just also wrong about it, and there was no way to be right without the information she didn't have yet. The crack in the heat exchanger of Petra's propane furnace had been there for between 8 and 14 months, by the later estimate of the technician who would replace it. It was not visible to the eye. It was the width of a human hair in one location, widening to 1.5 millimeters in another, running along a seam in the metal that cycled between heating and cooling 12 to 16 times a day, expanding and contracting, the crack breathing with the machine, larger and smaller with each cycle. What passed through it? The byproducts of combustion that should have vented out of the house. The carbon monoxide and its chemical family passed into the ductwork at a rate that varied with the temperature, with the running time, with how hard the system was working on any given night. February was the hardest the system had worked since the crack developed. The concentrations in the east side ductwork, the side that supplied Wren's room, and the hallway outside it, and the small bedroom next to it that Petra had been using as a home office, had been rising for weeks. Not fast, not in the acute, alarming way of a sudden failure. In the slow, incremental way that produces the symptoms Petra had been looking at for months and attributing to other things. The low-grade fever that cycled and didn't fully resolve. The persistent tiredness that she'd attributed to being a new mother. The mornings she woke with a headache she chalked up to poor sleep. A vague and persistent sense that she was not quite all right. The standard carbon monoxide detector in the hallway. A unit that met all current safety requirements. Installed at the height recommended in the packaging. Tested when she'd moved in. Was calibrated to alarm at concentrations above 70 parts per million, sustained over an hour or more. 70 parts per million is the point at which a healthy adult begins to experience symptoms that can no longer be attributed to other causes. Below that threshold, the alarm was silent. The concentrations in Wren's room were not reaching 70. They were reaching somewhere between 15 and 40, depending on the night, depending on how long the furnace had been running, depending on how tightly the room was sealed in the cold. 15 to 40 parts per million is below the adult alarm threshold. In an 8-month-old infant, with a smaller body, a faster respiratory rate, a developing nervous system with less tolerance for oxygen displacement, 15 to 40 parts per million is not nothing. It is not the acute emergency. But it is something. Applied over 7 months of nights, it is something that a pediatrician reviewing the pattern of ear infections and recurring low-grade fever and the mild developmental questions that had begun to surface would not have had the data to interpret. The detector was not malfunctioning. It was doing exactly what it was designed to do. It simply wasn't designed to catch what Boone could catch. The night of February 14th, Petra put Ren down at 7:30 after his bath and feeding, did the things she always did, checked the temperature in the room, verified the monitor, confirmed that the white noise machine was on the setting she preferred, and then went downstairs and ate soup and half-watched a show she'd been trying to get through for 2 weeks and fell asleep on the couch at 9:45 with the remote still in her hand. She woke up at 10:20, stiff and colder than she should have been, went upstairs, checked Ren again, and then went to bed properly. She slept. Boone was in the hallway when she passed it. She didn't break stride. She slept for 4 hours, which was more than she usually managed in a single stretch. She did not set an alarm because Ren had been, intermittently, starting to give her longer stretches at night, and she had learned to take sleep when it was available and not question it. At 2:47 in the morning, something woke her. Not the monitor. Not Ren. Not any sound she could immediately name. She surfaced from sleep with the particular sharpness of a person whose nervous system has been recalibrated by months of interrupted nights to treat any anomaly as requiring immediate assessment, and she lay there for 3 seconds identifying what was wrong. It was a sound. The sound was Boone. In the living room, which was wrong. At 2:47, which was wrong. Making the sound his nails made on hardwood when he was moving in tight, repetitive circles, which she had heard exactly once before, the night 3 years ago, when she'd come home to find a gas burner that had been left on, the night she'd walked through the front door, and he'd met her with that same urgent pacing and led her directly to the kitchen. She was out of bed before she was fully conscious. The hallway was empty. No Boone in front of the door. She registered this and kept moving down the stairs toward the sound. He was in the living room, at the window, and he turned when he heard her on the stairs. She would describe his face later as the most urgent she had ever seen it. Not frightened, not aggressive, but fully activated in a way that bypassed the social niceties of dog behavior and went straight to communication. He moved to the front door. He looked at her. He went to the hallway door. He came back. He did it twice, unhurried, deliberate, the precise sequence of an animal who has made a decision and is now implementing it. She said his name. He went to Ren's door and sat down. Petra was a nurse. She had learned, over years of shift work, to trust the part of her brain that operated below reasoning, the part that read rooms and bodies and situations before the conscious mind had assembled its explanation. There was a moment in any emergency when that part of the brain said, "Move." And you moved, and the explanation came after. She moved. She went to Ren's door. She opened it. The smell hit her before anything else. Not strong. Not the dramatic chemical assault she would have associated with the word gas. It was subtle. A quality to the air she had no vocabulary for. Something heavier than it should have been. Something that felt less like a smell than like a texture. A slight resistance. A sense of the room being slightly less itself than it usually was. Later, a firefighter would tell her that what she'd detected was likely not the carbon monoxide itself, which is odorless, but one of the accompanying combustion compounds that the furnace was producing alongside it, something her nose could register, even if her carbon monoxide detector could not. She was smelling what Boone had been smelling for 7 months. Standing in the doorway, she felt it. The particular quality of a room where the air has been compromised. Not dangerous in the way of a movie gas leak, nothing choking or blinding. Dangerous in the quiet way that the things that actually hurt you are dangerous. Ordinary looking, ordinary smelling, present in every molecule of air that her son had been breathing for the entire winter. Wren was in the crib. He was breathing. She watched the rise of his chest, and she did not stop watching it until she had crossed the room and picked him up. His small body warm and boneless with sleep, his breath against her neck soft and even. She carried him out. She stood in the hallway with her son in her arms and Boone at her feet, looking up at her, and she called 911. She could not, in the moment, have fully explained why. She had no official diagnosis. She had a smell she couldn't name, a dog in the wrong place at the wrong time, a feeling that would not be dismissed. She told the dispatcher she thought there might be something wrong with her heating system. She said she had a baby. She said she needed someone to come. The dispatcher stayed on the line with her. She took Wren to the living room, to the couch, and wrapped him in the blanket from the back of the sofa. And Boone followed them and sat at her feet and did not take his eyes off Wren's face. The firefighters arrived in 11 minutes. She counted. There were 4 of them. They brought equipment she didn't have names for, handheld devices with digital displays, longer probes that they extended into vents and registers, a monitor that one of them wore as they moved through the house in a systematic sweep, room by room, corner by corner. They worked with the quiet efficiency of people who have done this many times and who have learned not to alarm anyone before. They have something definite to say. The lead firefighter was a woman named Giordano, compact, gray-streaked, with the contained energy of someone who rationed her urgency carefully because she'd learned that how she moved affected how everyone around her moved. She came to where Petra was sitting on the couch with Wren in her lap and Boone at her feet, and she held a device so that Petra could see the reading on it, and she explained what the number meant. The reading in Wren's room was 38 parts per million at the ceiling vent, 22 at floor level, and had been at these concentrations, based on the pattern and source they'd identified, for approximately 4 to 6 hours that night, probably higher earlier in the evening, before the furnace cycled down, before the room's air had partially turned over through the gap under the door. She said, for an adult, this is not an acute emergency. For an infant, over a sustained period, this is a problem. She said, the question was how long it had been like this. She said, you're going to want to have the system fully inspected. Giordano did not perform panic, and Petra, who had spent years reading the faces of medical professionals delivering information, and knew how to read the gap between what was said and what was meant, read the face correctly. This was not fine. This was not nothing. This was the kind of thing that, left alone, moved towards something worse, along a trajectory no one would have seen coming. One of the other firefighters, younger, with the careful manner of someone newly enough in the work that he still let his concern show, had stopped at the couch on his way past and looked at Boone. He had asked, is this the dog that woke you? She had said yes. He had crouched down at Boone's level and looked at him for a moment. Not to pet him, just looked. And then he had stood up and kept moving, and she had not known what to make of that, the way he had stopped and looked, the specific quality of the look. Later, when the firefighters were packing up and Giordano was giving her the paperwork and the contact number for the furnace company they recommended, the younger one came to her again. He said, I've seen this before. Not often, but I've seen it. A dog that wouldn't leave a room, or kept going back to a vent, or woke someone up. He said, they pick up on it differently than the detectors do. He said, you should get the detector recalibrated. But he paused, and she could see him deciding how much to say, your dog is a good detector too. He said it simply, factually, without sentiment. She held it. She held Wren tighter. He was awake by now, puzzled by the noise and the light and the number of strangers in his living room, doing the thing he'd recently started doing when he was confused, looking up at her face to check if this was okay, taking his emotional cue from her expression. She kept her face calm. She kept it calm because she was a nurse, and that was what you did. And because she was a mother, and that was also what you did. And because Boone was at her feet and his presence was doing something for her that she didn't have a word for then, and still doesn't fully have a word for. The furnace technician arrived an hour after the firefighters. He spent 40 minutes in the basement and then came upstairs with a photograph on his phone showing the heat exchanger, a component she had not known the name of before that night, a component she would never forget the name of again. The crack was visible in the photograph only because of the way he'd lit it, a hairline on the surface of the metal that seemed too small to be responsible for what it had apparently been doing for the better part of a year. He said, "This has been going on a while." He said, "You were lucky." Petra looked at Boone when he said that. She thought, yes, we were. But luck, she was already beginning to understand, was not quite the right word for it. Luck implied randomness. Luck implied no one had been paying attention. Someone had been paying attention. Someone had been paying attention every night for 7 months in a hallway that was slowly making him sick, and had kept paying attention and had known when the moment required something different from paying attention. What was the word for that? She would wonder later. What was the word for a choice that no one witnessed, repeated in the dark over 200 nights, that cost something, that never asked to be recognized? She didn't have the word yet. She thought she might spend a long time looking for it. She stayed at her mother's house for 12 days. Her mother, Cecile, was a woman who had raised 2 daughters on a teacher's salary after Petra's father left when Petra was 7, who had never been melodramatic about difficulty and had raised daughters accordingly. You look at what happened. You figure out what it means. You decide what you're going to do, and you do it. She received the information about the furnace and the detectors and Boone with the same practical reception she brought to everything, and then she made up the guest room and said Petra could stay as long as she needed to. Petra told the story many times in those 12 days. She told it in pieces, in different orders, to different people. To Cecile over dinner, to her sister Fiona on the phone, to Daija in a text that turned into a long call that neither of them had planned on. She told it with the clinical steadiness she defaulted to when she was managing something she hadn't fully processed yet. The dates, the concentrations, the crack in the heat exchanger, the trajectory of what could have happened. And she noticed, each time she told it, that she always paused in the same place. Not at the numbers, or the furnace, or the firefighters. At Boone in the hallway. At the image of him there, every night, in a position no one had asked him to take, in a place that was slowly making him sick, for a reason no one had understood. She thought about what she knew about carbon monoxide exposure in dogs. She looked it up on her phone in the evenings after Wren went down, while Boone slept at the foot of the guest bed with his chin on her feet. There was more than she'd expected. Dogs had been documented as detectors of carbon monoxide in the same accidental, observational way that so much animal perception gets documented, not through designed experiments, but through reported incidents, through the accumulating record of dogs who had alerted their owners, who had refused to enter rooms, who had woken people who should not have been woken. The mechanism was still being studied. The sensitivity was well above any manufactured detector could replicate. She read one account of a family in Minnesota whose golden retriever had scratched at the bedroom door for 40 minutes before. The wife finally got up to quiet the dog and found her husband unresponsive on the bed. She read about a retired couple in Ohio whose beagle had refused to go back inside after her morning walk for 3 days running, until they called an inspector who found a cracked heat exchanger identical to what had been wrong in Petra's house. She read a dry academic paper from a veterinary journal that discussed the olfactory sensitivity of domestic dogs to incomplete combustion, compounds and used language so careful and qualified that she had to read it twice before she understood what it was saying. Yes, they can smell it. They can smell it long before any instrument we have made can detect it. She put the phone down and watched Boone sleep. She thought about what it meant to have an instrument in your house that was better than the one you thought was protecting you. She thought about the gap between the two, the space between what the detector on the wall was calibrated to catch and what Boone's nose was registering every night. That gap had been occupied for 7 months by an animal who had decided that the gap was his responsibility. She had bought the detector and felt safe. She had not known that Boone was the reason the word safe was still accurate. She thought about the mornings she had stepped over him in the dark. She thought about how many times she had looked at him and registered him as a piece of the furniture of her life, a constant, a given, a thing that was simply there in the way that some things simply are. She thought about all the things she had not asked. The question she kept returning to, in the quiet of her mother's guest room, was not the clinical one, not how or why or what the mechanism was. Those questions had answers, or partial answers, and she had found most of them on her phone in the evenings. The question she couldn't stop circling was different. Why had he stayed? Not what made him able to detect it. What made him stay once he detected it? What made him, night after night, return to a place that was costing him something, and lie down and remain? She was a nurse. She understood the body's response to chronic low-level exposure. She understood that at the concentrations in that hallway, a dog would not experience acute pain, not the kind that produces immediate avoidance. But he would have experienced something. The nausea that reduced his appetite, the fatigue she had mistaken for winter, the mornings when he stood at the back door needing the outside air the way a person surfaces from water. These were not nothing. These were accumulating, and he had known where they came from. He had been reading that air every night, his nose cataloging the chemical signature of the problem, and he had gone back anyway. She held Wren and thought about the distance between what she'd known and what she should have asked, and she understood that this distance was not her fault, not a failure, not a thing she could have fixed by paying more attention. She had been doing everything right. She had been a good mother and a careful nurse and a responsible homeowner. She had been doing all of it, all at once, with the bandwidth of a person doing all of it alone. And in the hall, every night, something had known what she didn't know and stayed. She thought about that word, stayed, for a long time before she understood that it was the wrong word. Staying implied passivity, implied simply remaining. What Boone had done was not passive. What Boone had done was decide, repeatedly, against the evidence of his own discomfort, to be somewhere rather than somewhere else. It was a different kind of word than stay. It was closer to a word she was not sure she could say without it sounding too large for what he was. A dog. A 5-year-old brindle dog with ears that couldn't decide, but that she thought might be the accurate word anyway. She kept not saying it. She thought about it instead, in the dark of her mother's guest room, while Wren breathed in the pack-in play, and Boone breathed on her feet, and the word sat there quietly between all of it without needing to be named. It was Cecile who mentioned the vet. She mentioned it the way she mentioned most things, without ceremony, between tasks, in the matter-of-fact register of a woman who thought about the actual requirements of situations. They were in the kitchen after dinner, Cecile at the sink, Petra at the table with the baby monitor, and a cup of tea she kept forgetting to drink. Cecile said, "Had Petra had Boone checked, given everything?" Petra put down her mug. She thought about the mornings at the back door, the wait she now tried to remember. the appetite that had been off for months, the specific tiredness in his movement that she had attributed to the cold. She called the vet the next morning. Dr. Kofi Asay had been practicing veterinary medicine for 30 years in the same low-ceilinged clinic on the outskirts of a small Massachusetts city, with the same steady, methodical manner that patients, owners either found deeply reassuring or slightly unnerving, depending on whether they were the kind of person who preferred their bad news direct or cushioned. He was not unkind. He was precise, which is not the same thing, and his precision came from a genuine belief that the most caring thing he could do for the animals in his care was to see them accurately. Petra brought Boone in on a Thursday morning, 10 days after the firefighters had come. She sat in the examination room on the metal chair that had probably been there since the clinic opened, Boone at her feet with his head on her knee, as she told Dr. Asay the whole story. The hallway, the nights, the levels in the room, the timeline as best she could reconstruct it. She told it the way she told clinical information, in order, with specificity, without embellishment, and Dr. Asay listened to all of it without writing anything down, his pen still in his hand, his eyes on her. When she finished, he said, "All right, let me look at him." He examined Boone with the thoroughness that Petra recognized as the examination of a doctor who was not reassuring himself but actually looking. He palpated his abdomen. He listened to his chest for a long time. He looked at his gums, his eyes, the capillary refill in his mouth. He asked about appetite, about energy, about the backdoor mornings, about the stiffness Petra had noticed. He wrote things down as she answered. He drew blood. He weighed Boone. He said, "I need to look at the chart from his last visit." "When was that?" Petra said 8 months ago. Dr. Asay pulled the file. He looked at the number from 8 months ago. He looked at the scale. He put the two things next to each other on the examination table, and he was quiet for a moment in the way he would sometimes be quiet. Not a theatrical pause, not a performance of gravity, just the ordinary silence of a person placing two pieces of information side by side and understanding what they mean together. He said, "He's lost 7 pounds since his last visit." Petra looked at the number. 7 pounds. On a dog who weighed 62 pounds, that was more than 10% of his body weight. Across 8 months, with no obvious illness, no significant behavioral change, no dramatic event she had attributed to anything. Dr. Asay said, "The blood work will confirm, but the clinical picture is consistent with chronic exposure to carbon monoxide or its combustion-related compounds in an animal spending sustained time in an affected space." He said the word chronic. He said, the weight loss, the reduced appetite, the fatigue, these are how it presents in dogs over time. Not acute illness, slow erosion. The kind that develops gradually enough that it doesn't alarm anyone. He said, "He's been in that space every night," you said, "for 7 months." Petra said yes. Dr. Asay looked at Boone, who was sitting very still on the examination table, with his ears in their characteristic state of indecision and his eyes on Petra's face. He said, "The blood work will tell us more. But what I can tell you clinically is that this animal has been experiencing something, and that it didn't stop him." He didn't say anything else for a moment. Then he began to write up the treatment protocol. Fresh air, time, a supplement to support respiratory function, monitoring over the next 60 days. He said Boone would be fine. He said it with the measured confidence of a doctor who understood the difference between fine and recovered and was talking about the latter. Petra sat with her hand on Boone's back and heard the word fine and felt, for the first time since the night with the firefighters, something she didn't quite have a name for. Not relief. Relief was too simple. Something larger than relief, something that included grief as one of its components, and gratitude as another, and the particular disorientation of understanding that a thing you thought you knew had been something else entirely. She had looked at Boone for 7 months and seen her dog. She had not seen what he was doing. The blood panel came back 3 days later. Elevated carboxyhemethylone, the measurable trace of carbon monoxide exposure in the blood, the body's own record of what had passed through it, consistent with chronic low-level exposure. In an animal spending extended hours in a compromised space, Dr. Aussay called her himself to go over the numbers. He said they were not catastrophic. He said they were real. He said, whatever he was doing in that hallway, his body was keeping track. She asked the question she had already asked once, because she needed to hear what he would say a second time. She asked if Boone had known. There was a pause on the line, not long, not theatrical, just the natural pause of a careful man choosing his words. He said, "I've been a veterinarian for 30 years. I've stopped trying to draw clean lines around what animals understand. What I can tell you is that the behavior was consistent and sustained, and that it did not stop when it was costing him something. Whether that is knowing, in the way that word means something to you, I'm not able to say." He paused again. He said, "But I've seen a lot of animals do a lot of things over 30 years, and I can tell you that what you're describing is not nothing." Petra thanked him and hung up and stood in the kitchen of her mother's house for a while, watching the yard through the window where Boone was outside in the cold, standing with his face in the wind the way he did, his ears finally, both of them, fully folded over in the relaxed way that meant he was not on duty. She thought, 7 pounds. She thought, every night. She thought, he was sick and he went back. The house was cleared in March. New furnace, new heat exchanger, new ductwork inspection, new carbon monoxide detectors, 3 of them now, calibrated to lower concentrations than the previous model, positioned according to updated guidelines, tested in front of Petra by the technician who installed them. She watched all of it. She asked questions she hadn't known to ask in October, when she had first moved in, when she had tested the single detector and accepted that the house was safe because the device said so. She brought Boone home on a Thursday afternoon. He walked through every room, not frantically, with the quiet, systematic attention he brought to things that mattered, stopping at the registers, pressing his nose to baseboards, checking corners she didn't know he checked. He went through the east side of the house, the rooms the old ductwork had fed, in the careful, methodical way of an animal doing an inventory. He went into Wren's room and stood there for almost a full minute, his nose working, his ears cycling through configurations, and then he sat down in the middle of the room and looked at Petra. He wagged once. She understood that to mean clean. She had no scientific basis for this interpretation. She made it anyway. That night, Boone did not sleep in the hallway. He slept in the living room, on the big fleece bed that had been gathering dust in the corner since before Wren was born. He was asleep before 10, which was early for him. She checked on him twice before she went to bed. She could not help it, and both times he was fully asleep, his large body spread and heavy across the fleece in the specific way of an animal in deep, genuine rest, the muscles slack in a way they had not been in months. His ears were folded over, both of them. She stood in the doorway at 2 a.m. with the baby monitor in her hand and the new carbon monoxide detector blinking green on the wall behind her, and she watched him sleep for a long time. There was a word she kept circling without landing on it. She had tried gratitude, and it was insufficient. She had tried love, and it was too ordinary for what she meant. She thought about what it was to stay somewhere because you had decided to stay even when staying cost you something, to occupy a position that no one had assigned you and no one would recognize, in a darkness where no one was watching. She thought about the unfinished food bowls. She thought about the mornings at the back door, gulping cold air. She thought about 7 pounds. She went to bed. She slept all the way to morning. Ren is 2 now. He runs in the headlong way of toddlers who have learned that the most efficient route to any destination is straight through everything in the way. He says mama and more and no and dog, and a version of Boone's name, Boo, that began as approximation and became something official, the way that names sometimes do when they are given by someone who doesn't know their naming. He says Boo, and Boone lifts his head and finds the child and confirms his location in the room before going back to whatever he was doing. He knows where Ren is at all times. This is not something Petra has arranged or trained or even particularly encouraged. It is simply a fact of the house, as constant as the layout of the rooms, the way Boone orients himself in any space with reference to where Ren is in it, the way his ears come up when Ren goes quiet in a room Boone can't see into, the way he positions himself in the kitchen during meals, in a location that gives him a line of sight to the high chair. Some visitors find this remarkable. Petra has stopped finding it remarkable in the way you stop finding remarkable the things that are simply true. It is what it is. It is Boone. Boone is 5. His weight is 62 pounds, where it was and where it belongs. His coat still catches light differently depending on the angle, still refuses to be a single consistent color in photographs. The brindle doing something in afternoon light that looks almost amber, and something in morning light that reads almost black. His ears still cannot decide. He sleeps in the living room most nights, on the fleece bed, in the deep, uncomplicated way of an animal at rest. On some mornings, not every morning, but some, Boone comes to the doorway of Ren's room. He stands there for a moment. He doesn't go in. He reads whatever he reads, and then he turns and goes back down the hallway to find his breakfast. Petra has watched this happen enough times that she has developed a sense of its rhythm. He goes to the doorway. He stands. He turns away. There is nothing alarming in his manner when he does this. It has the quality of routine rather than vigilance, of a thing that has become ordinary precisely because it needs to remain ordinary, the way a doctor washes her hands between patients, not from fear, but from understanding. The detector on the wall blinks green. The furnace, serviced last October, runs clean. The air in that room is what air is supposed to be. He checks anyway. She has stopped wondering whether she should intervene in this, whether she should redirect him, break the pattern, teach him that the checking is no longer necessary. She has decided it isn't hers to stop. He is not suffering. He is not anxious. He goes to the doorway, and he reads the air, and he determines that it is fine. And he turns away satisfied, and this takes him perhaps 30 seconds, and then he goes to get his breakfast. It is the smallest possible thing. She never asks what he's checking for. She knows that he is checking. There is a detail from those 7 months that she returns to more than any other. Not the night Boone came to find her. Not the phone call to 911. Not the numbers on the firefighter's meter or the weight on the veterinary scale. The detail she returns to is smaller than all of those. During those 7 months, Petra fed Boone in the kitchen, which was where she had always fed him. His bowl was in its usual spot beside the back door. She would put the food down in the morning, and he would come and eat, or mostly eat, and then she would take the bowl up, and he would go back to whatever he was doing, which, she now understood, was mostly going back to the hallway and resuming his position there. On the mornings when the bowl wasn't finished, she had adjusted the portion. She had told herself he wasn't hungry. She had attributed it to the cold and the winter and the general variability of dog appetite and moved on. After the vet visit, after she understood what had been happening to him, she went back to those mornings in her memory. The bowl that wasn't empty, the amount he had left night after night because his stomach was doing what stomachs do when the blood has less oxygen in it than it should, turning away from food, making the calculations that bodies make when resources are allocated to survival. He had been nauseous, not dramatically. not in a way that fell over the threshold of what she would have noticed and acted on, but quietly, persistently, in the way that chronic exposure produces symptoms that never fully arrive, and steady undercurrent of not quite right that he had been managing for months, that he had been managing every morning while she filled his bowl and thanked him for being there and went about her day. He had been sick, and every evening he had gone back. This is the part of the story that people respond to. This is the part that stays. Not the firefighters, not the furnace, not the clinical explanation of how carbon monoxide moves through ductwork and accumulates in closed rooms. Those things are real, and they matter, and she tells them because they are the mechanism, because other parents should know, because the detector placement recommendations have changed since her incident was reported, because somewhere a furnace is degrading right now in a house with a sleeping child, and the information might reach someone in time. But the part that stays is Boone, 7 pounds lighter than he was supposed to be, over 8 months, in a house where the air was slowly wrong, lying in a hallway because he had decided to lie there, and that decision was not reversible regardless of the cost. Sick and lighter and back to the door. She thinks about this when she thinks about what it means to love something. She thinks about the forms of attention that operate below language, below the visible, in the register of the ordinary and ongoing, not the crisis, not the rescue, not the dramatic moment that gets remembered, the night after night of it, the showing up in the dark when no one is watching and nothing has happened yet, and the showing up is itself the entire thing. She thinks about the questions she didn't ask. She thinks about what it costs to be watched over by something that will not tell you it is watching over you, that will not ask to be seen for it, that will simply be there in the dark between you and whatever you haven't smelled yet. She thinks every night. She thinks sick and lighter and back. She thinks about the bowl that was never fully empty, and the back door every morning, and the 7 pounds that she found on a veterinary scale in February, and understood for the first time what they meant. She has no clean conclusion for any of this. She has Wren running through the house with the full-body commitment of a 2-year-old who has important things to accomplish before breakfast. She has a furnace that is serviced every October and a carbon monoxide detector that is tested on the 1st of every month and positioned at the height that current safety guidelines recommend, which is lower than where the previous one was. She has Boone, who comes to the doorway of Wren's room on some mornings and stands there and reads the air and then turns away, who sleeps in the living room now, who eats everything in his bowl, who is, by every measure, fine. A word she uses carefully now, knowing what it can hide, knowing the things that can be true at the same time as fine. He is fine. He was there every night. Those two things live together in her. They will always live together in her. The carbon monoxide detector in Wren's hallway was replaced with a unit calibrated to detect concentrations below the previous model's alarm threshold. The contractor who repaired the furnace told Petra she didn't need to upgrade. The old detector had met all applicable safety standards. She upgraded it anyway. She bought 2 extras and installed one in her bedroom. Boone's blood panel returned to normal values by late spring. He gained back all 7 pounds by the following August. Dr. Asse keeps Boone's file in a folder he occasionally shows to veterinary students when teaching about environmental exposure. He doesn't use dramatic language when he shows it. He presents the timeline and the numbers, and then he is quiet for a moment, and he lets the students decide what to make of it. On the 1st of every month, Petra tests the detector in the hallway. Boone is always somewhere in the house when she does. He never looks at it. He doesn't need to.